I pushed through the double doors of St. Francis Hospital, and the familiar onslaught of noise hit me like a tidal wave. The shrill beeps of monitors, the rapid footsteps of nurses, the hushed voices of doctors conferring over charts, and the occasional cry from a patient. It was the soundtrack of my life, a never-ending cacophony that I had grown used to over the years. But this morning, every sound felt like nails on a chalkboard. I hadn't even had my first cup of coffee yet, and I could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on my shoulders. My sleep had been interrupted by nightmares, again. Dreams of surgeries gone wrong, patients slipping away on the table, my hands stained with blood that wouldn't wash off. I shook my head, trying to clear the lingering fog. There was no room for doubt or hesitation in my line of work. As I made my way down the corridor, I passed the nurses' station where Sarah, the head nurse, was busy coordinating the chaos. Her sharp eyes flicked up to me, and she nodded. "Morning, Dr. Leonardo," she called out over the noise. "Morning, Sarah," I replied, trying to muster a smile. Sarah was one of the few people in the hospital who could keep things running smoothly. She was a lifeline on days when everything felt like it was falling apart. I spotted Caroline near the pediatric ward. She was bent over a chart, her long blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, a few loose strands framing her tired face. Even from a distance, I could see the slump in her shoulders. I knew that look all too well. It was the look of someone who was running on fumes. I made my way over to her, weaving through the throng of people moving in every direction. "Hey, Caroline," I said, tapping her gently on the shoulder. She looked up, and for a moment, her face brightened. "Leo, good morning," she said, her smile barely reaching her eyes. "You look like you slept about as well as I did." "Is it that obvious?" I asked, half joking. "You know me, always burning the midnight oil. How about you?" She sighed and rubbed her forehead. Same old, same old. I had a kid come in with a fever of 104, screaming bloody murder. It took 3 nurses to hold him down while I checked his vitals. And don't get me started on the parents. They act like I'm supposed to have a magic wand that can fix everything instantly. I nodded. Yeah, it's been one of those weeks. I can't remember the last time I had a patient who was actually grateful. Everyone's either suing or screaming. Caroline chuckled dryly. I had a parent last week who threatened to sue me because her kid wouldn't stop crying after getting a shot. She said I traumatized him for life. Imagine that, traumatized for life by a needle. I snorted. People are ridiculous. It's like they forget that we're human too. Sometimes I think they believe we have superpowers. Caroline gave me a tired smile. If only, right? I could use some superpowers right about now. Just then, a pager went off, the sound cutting through our conversation. Caroline checked hers and groaned. "I've got to go. There's a kid with suspected appendicitis in room 302. Never a dull moment." I watched her walk away, her steps heavy with exhaustion. As she disappeared down the hall, I felt a pang of sympathy. Caroline was one of the best pediatricians I knew, patient, compassionate, always putting her patients first. But I could see the toll it was taking on her. The long hours, the constant stress, the emotional drain. It was the same toll it was taking on me, on all of us. I continued down the corridor, my thoughts swirling. There was a part of me that envied Caroline. Despite everything, she still seemed to care. She still found meaning in the work we did. I, on the other hand, felt like I was going through the motions most days. The spark that had driven me to become a surgeon in the first place had faded, replaced by a cynicism that was hard to shake. I turned a corner and nearly collided with Dr. Patel, a young intern with wide eyes and a nervous energy that reminded me of a rabbit caught in headlights. "Sorry, Dr. Leonardo," she blurted out, clutching a stack of charts to her chest. "I was just looking for you. There's a patient in room 405 with post-op complications. Dr. Stevens asked if you could take a look." I suppressed a sigh. Of course. Lead the way. As we walked, Patel began rattling off the details of the case. I listened, nodding in the right places, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't shake the sense of disillusionment that had settled in my bones. Once upon a time, this place had felt like home. The operating room had been my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself in the precision and focus required to save a life. Now it felt like a prison, each shift a sentence I had to endure. We reached room 405, and I steeled myself for what awaited inside. Another patient, another problem to solve, another reminder of why I was here. I pushed open the door, and the noise of the hospital seemed to fade away, replaced by the steady beeping of monitors and the faint scent of antiseptic. And just like that, I was back in the game, my mind focused, my hands steady. Because no matter how tired or disillusioned I was, this was what I did. This was who I was. The first chapter paints a picture of the hectic, demanding environment in which Leonardo and Caroline work. Their dialogue reveals their weariness and frustrations, while also hinting at the underlying dedication they both still have despite their exhaustion. The introduction of a younger, less experienced colleague, Dr. Patel, contrasts with Leonardo's seasoned cynicism, highlighting the emotional journey he's been on. I was on my way to the OR, mentally preparing myself for a long day of back-to-back surgeries, when I heard Caroline calling my name. I turned to see her hurrying down the hallway, her expression more serious than usual. I knew right away that this wasn't a social visit. Caroline didn't do small talk when there was work to be done. "Leo, wait up," she called out, catching up to me. Her cheeks were flushed, and there was a worried look in her eyes. "I need your help with a patient." I stopped and turned to face her, my interest piqued. "What's going on?" "It's a 10-year-old girl in the pediatric ward," Caroline said, handing me a chart. "Her name is Emma. She came in with a severely swollen belly. I've never seen anything like it. It looks like she's pregnant, but obviously that's impossible. Our mother is freaking out, saying it's a tumor and demanding immediate surgery." I flipped through the chart, scanning the basic information. No ultrasound yet. Caroline shook her head. "Not yet. We're still waiting for the technician, and in the meantime, her mother is threatening to transfer Emma to another hospital if we don't operate right now." I glanced up from the chart, frowning. Why does everyone always jump to the worst-case scenario? There are plenty of things that could cause a swollen belly besides a tumor. Caroline sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know. I tried explaining that to her, but she's not listening. She's convinced her daughter is dying. I was hoping you could talk to her. You're better at handling these kinds of situations." I snorted. Better at dealing with hysterical parents? Hardly. But I'll give it a shot. I handed the chart back to Caroline. "Let's go see Emma." We walked down the hallway toward the pediatric ward, the tension between us thick in the air. Caroline was silent, and I could tell she was worried. She always took cases involving children personally. Maybe that was what made her such a good pediatrician. She cared too much. When we reached Emma's room, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the girl on the bed. She looked even smaller than 10, her body dwarfed by the oversized hospital gown. Her belly was visibly swollen, The fabric stretched tight over the roundness of it. Her eyes were wide with fear, darting between me and Caroline as we entered. Beside her stood her mother, a thin woman with a strained expression. Her hands were clasped together so tightly that her knuckles were white. "Good morning," I said, adopting my best reassuring doctor's tone. "I'm Dr. Leonardo. I understand you're worried about your daughter, Mrs. Jenkins. Why don't we take a moment to talk about what's going on?" Mrs. Jenkins didn't waste a second. "Worried? Of course, I'm worried. Look at her," she said, her voice rising. "She's just a child, and her belly is swollen like she's 8 months pregnant. I want her in surgery now. I won't wait for some ultrasound." I held up a hand, trying to calm her down. "I understand you're scared, but jumping straight to surgery isn't the answer. Surgery is serious, especially for someone Emma's age. We need to know what we're dealing with first." "What if it's cancer?" Mrs. Jenkins shot back, her eyes filling with tears. "What if she's dying, and you're just standing here doing nothing?" "I promise you, we're not doing nothing," I said softly. "There are many reasons why a child's belly could be swollen. It could be something as simple as a blockage or a cyst. We need to run some tests to be sure." Emma's eyes were glued to mine, and I saw a glimmer of hope there. She wasn't crying, but I could see she was close to it. She was scared, and that fear was feeding off her mother's panic. I turned my attention to her, crouching down to her level. "Hi, Emma," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle. "Can you tell me when your belly started hurting?" Emma hesitated, then said in a small voice, "A couple of weeks ago. It wasn't bad at first, but then it started getting bigger, and it hurt more when I ate." I nodded. "Okay, that's good to know. Thank you for telling me. We're going to take some pictures of your belly, like an X-ray, but it's called an ultrasound. It won't hurt, and it'll help us see what's going on inside. Is that okay?" Emma nodded, but Mrs. Jenkins crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "This is a waste of time," she said. "You should just take her into surgery now." I stood up, meeting her gaze head-on. "Mrs. Jenkins, I understand you're scared, but rushing into surgery without a proper diagnosis could be dangerous. We need to confirm what we're dealing with. I've seen cases like this before where the problem was something simple that didn't require surgery. Please, trust us to do what's best for Emma." Mrs. Jenkins hesitated, her eyes flicking between me and her daughter. Finally, she let out a shaky breath and nodded. "Fine. But if you don't figure out what's wrong soon, I'm taking her to another hospital." "Fair enough," I said. "We'll get the ultrasound done right away." Caroline stepped forward, offering a small smile. "We'll take good care of Emma, Mrs. Jenkins. I'll be with her the whole time." With that, we left the room, and I could feel Caroline's relief radiating off her. "Thank you," she said quietly as we walked down the hallway toward the ultrasound room. I knew I should be able to handle these things, but sometimes the parents just get to me. I shrugged. "You did fine. Parents freak out when it comes to their kids. It's natural. Our job is to stay calm and do what needs to be done." "Yeah, I know," Caroline said, her voice tinged with doubt. Sometimes I wonder if I'm cut out for this. For pediatrics, I mean. The emotional side of it gets to me more than it should." I stopped and looked at her. "Caroline, you're one of the best pediatricians in this hospital. You care about your patients. That's what makes you good at your job. Don't let one difficult parent make you doubt yourself." She gave me a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Leo. I needed to hear that." We reached the ultrasound room, and I watched as Caroline gently guided Emma onto the table, talking to her in soothing tones. I could see the genuine care in her eyes, the way she held Emma's hand, and for a moment I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, maybe, or a sense of purpose. This was why we did what we did. For kids like Emma, to give them a chance, to figure out what was wrong and make it right. I took a deep breath and stepped into the room, ready to find the answers that Emma and her mother so desperately needed. This chapter delves deeper into the challenges faced by Leonardo and Caroline, showcasing their interactions with a worried parent and a scared child. It also highlights their personal struggles and the emotional weight that comes with being a healthcare provider. The ultrasound revealed nothing definitive, just more questions. There was no obvious tumor, no signs of fluid buildup, and no clear indication of what was causing Emma's belly to swell so dramatically. It was as if her body was keeping secrets from us, secrets that might be locked away somewhere we hadn't yet looked. I watched Caroline's face as she studied the images, her brow furrowed in concentration. "That can't be it," Caroline muttered, frustration edging her voice. "We should have seen something by now. A blockage, a mass, anything." I nodded, feeling the same rising tide of irritation. "Yeah, but all we have are shadows. I think we need to run a few more tests. Maybe an MRI. Something that'll give us a better picture of what's going on inside her." Caroline looked at me, her face etched with worry. "You know what that means. Emma's mom is going to have a fit." She was barely willing to wait for the ultrasound results. "If we tell her we need more tests." "We're doctors, not miracle workers," I replied, my tone clipped. "It's our job to make sure we know exactly what we're dealing with before we do anything drastic. If that means pissing off an overbearing parent, then so be it." Caroline gave me a hesitant nod, but I could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. She wasn't the type to brush off a parent's concerns so easily. Her compassion, while admirable, sometimes made her second-guess the hard calls. "Come on," I said, gesturing toward the door. "Let's go talk to Mrs. Jenkins." As we walked back to Emma's room, I could feel a tension in the air. It was almost palpable, like a storm cloud gathering overhead. I knew we were walking into a difficult conversation, and part of me dreaded it. Confrontations with parents were never easy, especially when their fear turned into anger, but it was a necessary part of the job. We reached Emma's room, and I knocked lightly before opening the door. Mrs. Jenkins was pacing back and forth at the foot of Emma's bed, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She whirled around as we entered, her eyes flashing with anger. "Finally," she snapped, her voice brittle. "What did the ultrasound show? Is it a tumor? Does she need surgery?" Caroline stepped forward, her expression calm. "Mrs. Jenkins, the ultrasound didn't show anything conclusive. There's no evidence of a tumor, which is good news, but we still don't know what's causing the swelling. We'd like to run some additional tests, starting with an MRI, to get a clearer picture." Mrs. Jenkins's face turned red, her hands clenching into fists. "More tests. You're telling me you still don't know what's wrong with my daughter? What kind of doctors are you? I told you she needs surgery. You're wasting time." I stepped in, trying to defuse the situation. "Mrs. Jenkins, I understand you're upset. We're concerned about Emma too, but surgery without a clear diagnosis could be risky. We need to be sure about what we're dealing with before we take any action." "Risky?" Mrs. Jenkins spat. "What's risky is doing nothing while my daughter's belly keeps growing. Look at her. She's in pain. I'm her mother. I know when something is seriously wrong. I demand you operate now." Emma's eyes were wide, filled with a mix of fear and embarrassment. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the hospital bed. I felt a pang of sympathy for her. Children should never have to see their parents unravel like this, especially not when they're the ones in need of comfort. Caroline tried again, her voice gentle. "Mrs. Jenkins, we're only trying to do what's best for Emma. I promise you, we're doing everything we can to figure out what's wrong. We just need a little more time." Time. Mrs. Jenkins scoffed. "We don't have time. I want a second opinion. No, I want her transferred to another hospital where they know what they're doing. Clearly, this place is useless." I felt a surge of frustration. I knew her reaction was driven by fear, but that didn't make it any easier to deal with. I glanced at Caroline, who looked on the verge of tears. She hated feeling like she was failing a patient. I couldn't let this spiral out of control. "Mrs. Jenkins," I said, my voice firm, "if you want a second opinion, that's your right. But transferring Emma to another hospital will take time, and there's no guarantee they'll do anything differently. We have a top-tier team here, and we're committed to finding out what's wrong with your daughter. Please, give us a chance to do our job." Mrs. Jenkins glared at me, her eyes blazing with defiance. For a moment, I thought she was going to continue her tirade, but then her shoulders slumped, and the fight seemed to drain out of her. She turned to look at Emma, who was staring at her with wide, anxious eyes. "Emma," Mrs. Jenkins said softly, her voice cracking, "do you want to stay here? Do you trust these doctors?" Emma hesitated, glancing between me and Caroline. She bit her lip, then nodded slowly. "Yes, Mom, I trust them." Mrs. Jenkins took a shaky breath, then nodded as well. "Okay," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Okay, but if you don't find out what's wrong soon, I swear I'll take her out of here myself." I nodded. "We'll start the MRI right away." As we left the room, I could see Caroline's hands shaking. She leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths to steady herself. "That was rough," she said, her voice strained. "I hate feeling like we're not doing enough." "We are doing enough," I said firmly. "We're doing what's right. Mrs. Jenkins is scared, and I get that, but rushing into surgery without knowing the facts is reckless. Emma trusts us, and we have to honor that trust by doing our job the right way." Caroline nodded, her eyes still clouded with worry. "I just hope we figure out what's wrong soon, for Emma's sake." "We will," I said, more confidently than I felt. "We have to." This chapter dives into the emotional turbulence of dealing with a panicked parent who demands action, regardless of the risks. It highlights the difficulty doctors face in balancing the immediate concerns of family members with the professional obligation to ensure a correct diagnosis and safe treatment plan. Leonardo's pragmatic approach contrasts with Caroline's empathetic nature, showing how both doctors handle the pressure of high-stress situations differently. The MRI results came back within an hour, and Caroline and I found ourselves hunched over the scans in the dimly lit radiology room. The images glowed on the screen, casting an eerie light on our faces. I stared at the cross-sections of Emma's belly, searching for clues, for anything that could explain the mystery of her condition. Caroline was quiet beside me, her eyes darting over the images. Her fingers tapped restlessly on the table, a telltale sign of her anxiety. I could practically hear her thoughts racing, running through the list of possible diagnoses like a Rolodex in her mind. "There," I said, pointing at a section of the scan that looked abnormal. A shadowy mass, not clearly defined, but there nonetheless. "That's something, isn't it? It doesn't look like a tumor. Maybe a blockage." Caroline leaned in closer, squinting at the image. "It's not a clean shape," she murmured. "Could be a foreign body. It's hard to tell. I've seen blockages look like this in adults, but in a child, it's strange. She didn't report swallowing anything unusual, did she?" I shook my head. Her mother didn't mention anything, and Emma didn't either. But kids aren't always honest about these things, especially if they're scared. Caroline sighed. "It's still all guesswork. We need more information. Maybe we should ask Emma again, away from her mother. Sometimes kids open up more when their parents aren't around." "Good idea," I said. "But what do we tell Mrs. Jenkins in the meantime? She's going to demand answers, and this," I gestured at the vague image on the screen, "isn't much of one." Caroline bit her lip, a habit she had when she was deep in thought. "Maybe we frame it as a step in the process. We tell her what we know so far, what it isn't, and what it might be. Suggest that we do an endoscopy to get a clearer view." "That's still not a definitive answer," I said, running a hand through my hair in frustration. "We're just playing a guessing game at this point." "It's better than doing nothing," Caroline replied softly. "Or worse, jumping straight to surgery without knowing what we're dealing with. Emma's young. Her body can handle more tests, but surgery is a big deal." I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling heavily on my shoulders. "All right, let's talk to Emma first. See if she remembers anything she might have swallowed, and then we'll deal with Mrs. Jenkins." We left the radiology room and headed back to the pediatric ward. Emma's room was quiet when we entered, a stark contrast to the tension-filled atmosphere we had left behind. Emma was lying on the bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her small hands resting on her swollen belly. She looked so fragile, so small in the big hospital bed. "Hey, Emma," I said softly, pulling a chair up beside her bed. Caroline took the other side, her face set in a gentle, reassuring expression. "We just wanted to ask you a few more questions, okay?" Emma turned her head toward me, her eyes wide and nervous. She nodded. "You're doing great, Emma," Caroline said, giving her a warm smile. "We're just trying to figure out what's making your belly hurt, so we can help you feel better. Can you think really hard and tell us if you might have swallowed anything that could be causing this? Maybe something small, like a toy or a piece of food." Emma's brow furrowed, and she bit her lip, thinking hard. "I don't think so," she said slowly. "I don't remember swallowing anything." "Are you sure?" I pressed gently. "Sometimes kids swallow things without realizing it. Maybe when you were playing or eating, something slipped into your mouth by accident." Emma hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I don't think so. I would remember, wouldn't I?" Caroline and I exchanged a glance. It wasn't unusual for kids to forget or not realize they'd swallowed something, but Emma seemed genuinely unsure. I decided to try a different approach. "Emma," I said, leaning in a little closer, "has your belly ever hurt like this before? Even a little bit?" Emma nodded slowly. "Sometimes, but not like this. It started hurting more a few weeks ago. That's when it started getting big." "Okay," I said, trying to keep my frustration from showing. "Thank you for telling us. You're doing really well." Caroline reached out and squeezed Emma's hand. "We're going to figure this out, okay? We just need to do a few more tests." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Is it going to hurt?" "No," Caroline said quickly. "We'll make sure it doesn't hurt. We just need to look inside your belly with a camera, like the ones they use on TV. It's called an endoscopy. You'll be asleep the whole time, and you won't feel a thing." Emma nodded, but I could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. "Can my mom come?" "Of course," Caroline said, giving her hand another squeeze. "She'll be right there when you wake up." We left Emma's room and headed to the waiting area where Mrs. Jenkins was pacing back and forth. As soon as she saw us, she rushed over, her face tense with anxiety. "Well," she demanded, "what did you find? Is it a tumor?" "No, we don't think it's a tumor," I said, holding up a hand to calm her. "But we did see something in the MRI that we need to investigate further. It might be a blockage or something Emma swallowed without realizing it. We want to do an endoscopy to get a clearer view." Mrs. Jenkins' eyes widened. "An endoscopy? Isn't that risky? Can't you just operate and take it out?" "Surgery without knowing what we're dealing with could be far riskier," Caroline interjected, her voice calm. "The endoscopy will give us a better idea of what's causing the swelling without the need for a major operation. It's minimally invasive, and Emma will be asleep the whole time. She won't feel any pain." Mrs. Jenkins's face softened slightly, but the worry lines around her eyes didn't disappear. "And if you still can't figure it out?" "Then we'll consider our next steps carefully," I said. "We're doing everything we can to avoid unnecessary surgery. We want to make sure we have all the facts before we proceed." Mrs. Jenkins nodded reluctantly. "All right. Do the endoscopy. But I want to be there when she wakes up. I don't want her to be alone." "Of course," Caroline said, her voice soothing. "You'll be right by her side the whole time." As we walked back toward the prep room to arrange the procedure, I felt the knot of tension in my chest tighten. We were running out of options, and Emma's condition was a puzzle that didn't fit any of the usual patterns. It was becoming increasingly clear that this wasn't just a case of guessing the right diagnosis. It was a test of our patience, our knowledge, and our ability to keep our emotions in check. Caroline glanced at me as we walked, her expression mirroring my own anxiety. "Do you think we're missing something?" she asked quietly. "Maybe," I admitted. "Or maybe this is just one of those cases where the answer isn't obvious. We'll find out soon enough." Caroline nodded, but I could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. It was the same doubt gnawing at me, a persistent, nagging fear that we might not find the answer in time. But for Emma's sake, we had to keep trying. Because sometimes all we could do was take it one step at a time, hoping that the next test, the next scan, would finally give us the answers we needed. This chapter continues to explore the frustrations and emotional strain faced by Leonardo and Caroline as they navigate the uncertainties of diagnosing Emma's condition. The dialogue highlights the communication between doctors, the patient, and her parent, underscoring the delicate balance of honesty, empathy, and medical caution. Leonardo's pragmatic approach contrasts with Caroline's empathetic bedside manner, emphasizing their complementary skills in handling both the clinical and emotional aspects of patient care. After arranging Emma's endoscopy, I made my way to the small on-call room at the end of the pediatric ward. The hospital felt quieter than usual, the typical bustle of nurses and patients reduced to a muted hum. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, letting it close softly behind me. The room was dimly lit, the blinds drawn to keep out the harsh glare of the afternoon sun. I sank into the worn-out armchair in the corner, my body sinking into the soft cushions as if it had been begging for this moment all day. It was the only place in the hospital where I could get a few moments of solitude, where the weight of responsibility wasn't quite so crushing. I closed my eyes, resting my head against the back of the chair, and took a deep breath. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee lingered in the air, familiar yet somehow comforting. It was the scent of my life now, a life consumed by work, by endless rounds, and by the constant need to be on high alert. I reached into the pocket of my scrubs and pulled out my phone. No new messages. I glanced at the time. It had been nearly 12 hours since I walked into the hospital, and I had at least another 6 to go. I should have been used to these hours by now, but each shift felt like it drained me a little more, left me a little emptier. I heard a knock on the door and looked up to see Caroline standing in the doorway. Her face was drawn, the strain of the day evident in the lines etched across her forehead. She gave me a tired smile, stepping into the room and closing the door softly behind her. "Hey," she said, leaning against the wall. "You okay?" "Just tired," I replied, rubbing my eyes. I feel like I've been running on fumes for weeks. This whole thing with Emma, it's getting to me. Caroline nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I know what you mean. It's hard when we don't have the answers. Makes you feel helpless." "Yeah," I agreed. "And it's not just Emma. It's everything. Every patient, every case. It's like it never stops. There's always something going wrong, always someone needing help. And no matter how much we do, it's never enough." Caroline walked over to the small coffee maker on the counter and poured herself a cup of lukewarm coffee. She took a sip, grimacing at the taste, then set the cup down and turned to face me. "Do you ever think about getting out?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft. "Leaving medicine, I mean. Doing something else." I looked at her, surprised. "You? Wanting to leave? You're one of the best pediatricians I've ever met. I thought you loved this job." "I do," she said quickly. "I love helping kids. But sometimes it just gets to be too much. The long hours, the emotional drain, the constant pressure. It's hard to keep going when you feel like you're running on empty all the time." "I get that," I said quietly. "I've thought about it too. Walking away, finding something that doesn't make me feel like I'm drowning. But then I think, what else would I do? This is all I know." Caroline sat down on the edge of the desk, looking down at her hands. "Maybe that's the problem," she said. "We've given everything to this job, to this hospital, and there's nothing left for us. No time for life outside of these walls. No time to just breathe." There was a long silence, the only sound the distant beeping of machines down the hall. I felt the weight of her words, the truth in them. We had both sacrificed so much to be here, to be good doctors, to save lives. But somewhere along the way, we had lost sight of ourselves, of what we needed to stay whole. "I don't know if I can do this forever," Caroline admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know if I want to." I didn't know what to say. I had seen this coming for a while, the signs of burnout in Caroline, in myself, the long shifts, the sleepless nights, the endless parade of sick children. It was enough to wear anyone down. But hearing her say it out loud made it real, made it something I couldn't ignore. "What would you do?" I asked, my voice rough. "If you left?" Caroline shrugged, a sad smile playing on her lips. "I don't know. Something where I can still help people, but maybe in a different way. Maybe I'd teach, work with med students, help them learn without all the pressure of being on the front lines." I could picture her doing that, her gentle nature and patience a perfect fit for teaching. She would be good at it, I knew, better than I could ever be. I wasn't built for teaching or for patience. I was a surgeon through and through. I thrived on the adrenaline, on the high stakes. But even I had my limits. "I don't know what I'd do," I admitted. "Maybe open a small clinic somewhere quiet. Somewhere that doesn't see as much chaos as this place. I used to think about that, back when I was in med school, having my own practice, where I could actually get to know my patients." Caroline's smile widened, a hint of her old self shining through. "You be good at that," she said. "You're gruff, but you care. More than you let on." "Don't let anyone hear you say that," I replied, managing a weak smile. "I have a reputation to maintain." Caroline laughed softly, and for a moment, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. It was nice just sitting here, talking like normal people, like friends. The hospital, the stress, the cases, it all faded into the background for a little while. But the moment couldn't last. There was a soft knock on the door, and a nurse poked her head in. "Dr. Ross, Dr. Miller, Emma's endoscopy is about to start." Caroline and I exchanged a glance, and the tension immediately returned, pulling us back into the reality of our roles. We both stood up, the brief respite over, and followed the nurse down the hall to the procedure room. The endoscopy took longer than expected. As I watched the screen, the camera snaking its way down Emma's esophagus, through her stomach, and into her intestines, I felt my frustration grow. There was no clear sign of obstruction, no foreign body that could explain the swelling. Just more of the same. Nothing conclusive, nothing definitive. I exchanged a glance with Caroline, who was standing beside me, her face a mask of concentration. "I don't see anything," I said quietly. "It's like her body's playing a trick on us." "Keep looking," she murmured. "There has to be something. There has to be a reason." But there wasn't. The camera moved through the small intestine, revealing nothing but normal tissue. I felt a sinking feeling in my gut, a sense of dread that maybe we had missed something, that maybe there was something lurking in the shadows, just out of reach. Finally, I pulled the camera back, the procedure ending without any answers. I could see the disappointment on Caroline's face, the frustration mirrored in my own. We were back to square one, and Emma was still suffering. We left the procedure room, peeling off our gloves and masks. Mrs. Jenkins was waiting in the hallway, her eyes wide with worry. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. There was no sign of any obstruction or foreign body. Emma's intestines looked normal. We're still not sure what's causing the swelling. Mrs. Jenkins's face crumpled, and she looked like she might cry. "But what does that mean? What do we do now?" "It means we need to keep looking," Caroline said gently. "We'll run more tests, take more scans. We won't stop until we find out what's wrong. I promise you that." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, wiping at her eyes. "Please just help her. I can't stand seeing her like this." "We will," I said, feeling the weight of her plea like a stone in my chest. "We'll figure this out." Later that night, I found myself alone in the on-call room again, staring at the ceiling. My mind was racing, going over every possibility, every misdiagnosis. I felt the exhaustion pulling at me, dragging me down. But sleep wouldn't come. It never did when I was like this, anxious, uncertain, feeling the creeping fingers of burnout tightening their grip around my throat. The truth was, I was scared. Scared of failing Emma, of failing myself. Scared that maybe I wasn't cut out for this, that maybe I had made a mistake dedicating my life to a job that took so much and gave back so little. I had spent so many years building this identity, this career, but now it felt like it was crumbling around me, leaving me empty. The door creaked open, and Caroline stepped inside. She looked just as tired as I felt, her eyes dark with exhaustion. She walked over to me, sitting down on the floor beside the chair, leaning her head back against the wall. "I can't stop thinking about Emma," she said softly. "What if we never figure it out? What if she gets worse?" "We will," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. We have to. Caroline closed her eyes, her face etched with weariness. I don't know how much longer I can do this, Leo. I'm so tired. I reached out, taking her hand. It was a small gesture, but it was all I could offer. We'll figure it out, I repeated, more for my own sake than hers. We have to. As we sat there in the quiet of the on-call room, I realized that maybe it wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was about holding on, about not giving up, even when the world felt like it was falling apart. Because as long as we kept trying, as long as we kept fighting, there was still hope. And sometimes that was all we had.